All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today on the 34,000 immigrant detention quota. As many of you know, this is part of our 34 days to end the 34,000 immigrant detention quota. These are our days of actions from June 9th until July 12th. So today, we're going to be talking about the detention bed quota, but before we want to just kind of go through some logistics. There's a chat window on the right of your screen. Feel free to write comments or questions as we're going through the webinar. And then we'll also have times throughout to allow for questions and answer sessions. So to ask a question, please click the hand with the green arrow, and the facilitator will call you when it's your turn. Because we obviously don't have a lot of time, we might not be able to get to everyone's questions, but we'll try our best. And in order to be able to speak, you will have to enter your audio pin. So today, as presenters, we're going to have Madhu Brewal, who's the Policy Counsel with Detention Watch Network. We also have Anu Joshi, the Grassroots Advocacy Associate from the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, and myself, Catalina Nieto. I'm the Field Director with Detention Watch Network. So the agenda for today's webinar, we're going to do a very quick overview of immigration detention in the U.S. And then Madhu's going to walk us through what the immigration detention quota is and share with us some of the history and current context of the quota. And then she'll also share a little bit more about understanding the appropriations process. And then we'll talk about advocacy to end the quota, both on the House and the Senate. And then we'll share more about the End The Quota campaign and some of the organizing work that has been going on throughout the country to end the quota. And then talk a little bit more about the 34 days to end the 34,000 immigrant detention quota. So, just to do a quick overview of immigration detention in the U.S., obviously, you know, the quota makes part of this much larger system of detention and deportation in the country. So right now, the U.S. immigrant detention and deportation system has expanded drastically over the last 20 years, and the U.S. right now has the largest immigrant detention infrastructure in the world. And today, the government locks up and deports more immigrants than ever before. The pictures here, one is of Stewart Detention Center in Georgia. It's one of the largest immigrant detention centers in the country, and it's located in Lumpkin, Georgia, one of the poorest counties in Georgia. And it's operated by Correction Corporations of America. And the other picture here is from Etowah County Detention Center in Gazella, Alabama. This was after an action there, and we see some of the people that are detained there putting signs saying that we miss our kids. So I was saying before, the U.S. Immigrant detention system has expanded drastically, particularly in the last 20 years. We can see here in the graph that 1996 in particular marked a turning point. In 1996, the U.S. enacted legislation that dramatically expanded the use of detention. This legislation is the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. And these expanded the use of mandatory detention to large categories of non-citizens. And then we can also see in this graph another somewhat of a turning point as well. During 2002-2003, there was some restructuring, and Congress creates the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11, and under the Department of Homeland Security, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Protection, and the Citizenship and Immigration Services were formed. But I think what's important to note as well is that in 2004, ICE came out with their strategic plan called Operation Endgame, where they had a 10-year goal to deport all deportable immigrants or individuals from the U.S. By 2012. So we see, after that, obviously, the expansion of many deportation programs that target immigrant communities, such as 287G, Secure Communities, and the Criminal Alien Program that has funneled thousands and thousands of people into detention and deportation. And then the most recent numbers that we have is in 2012, where ICE detained an estimated 478,000 immigrants, and ICE's current detention budget is just short of $2 billion. And then obviously most recently, the detention bed quota. So this is what we have now. This is the map of detention centers across the country. There's over 250 county and state jails and private prisons and federal facilities. So to now go deeper into the bed quota, Madhu is going to share a little bit more about the history and current context.
One second while I pull up the webinar. All right. So thanks, Catalina. That was a great kind of contextual history of detention and what's happening. And so I want to just quickly go over the history of the detention bed quota, what it is, and a little bit about the appropriations process and how we've gotten here. So problems with, sorry, one second. There we go. All right. So what is the detention bed quota? So the detention bed quota started in 2009, and I'll get to a little bit about the history, but what it is it's language in congressional appropriations, which means this is the bill that governs ICE's detention budget, and it states that funding shall made available under this heading shall maintain a level of not less than 34,000 beds. So the way that ICE and some members of Congress have interpreted this language is to mean ICE must not only maintain 34,000 beds, but also fill 34,000 beds with immigrants at any given time. As a result, we've started calling this detention bed. It used to be called a mandate, but we've shifted the language to call it a quota because that's really what it's become. It's important to note that this type of a legislatively mandated quota is not used by any other law enforcement agency. And Catalina talked a little bit about, our record-breaking numbers under ICE. We've reached nearly 500,000 in fiscal year 2012. The quota has really contributed to these record-breaking detention numbers because it's really forcing ICE to go out there and fill these detention beds in their 250 plus facilities to the cost of over $2 billion a year and over $5 million a day to taxpayers. This number is arbitrary. It's unclear why release is not used more often, but I think because ICE has interpreted it as filling these beds, we believe that they are making detention decisions according to the quota and therefore not releasing people more often. There we go. So a little bit about the history of the quota. And DWN and the National Immigrant Justice Center, NIJC, both have fantastic websites with a ton of resources that have outlined the history of a quota, and NIJC came up with a really fantastic timeline that I encourage you to look at if you haven't already. So this is just a very, very brief timeline. in 2009, the quota was put into the appropriations bill by Senator Byrd, who was then chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And if you read our narrative, we talk a little bit about Senator Byrd. He has a history with the KKK and, you know, racist language, racist legislation. And so it wasn't a surprise to many of us to learn that he was responsible for the quota. Since 2009 to now, Congress has included the bed quota language in ICE's budget. So ICE's budget is contingent upon them maintaining this quota. And the president continues to ask for funding in detention beds. And to date, we have yet to see President Obama speak against the bed quota. So if you look on the left, these are the actual appropriations bill in every single bill from fiscal year 2010 to fiscal year 2014. The quota has been included, but at different numbers. So it started at 33,400, and then it's increased, and now it's at 34,000. The president has asked for a decrease in beds, particularly recently. If you look on the right, his most recent budget request for fiscal year 2015, which is the appropriation cycle that we're currently in, he has asked for 30,539 beds. And a lot of that has been a response to advocates really speaking out and saying we want the bed quota eliminated. He's not eliminating it. However, he has started asking for less beds. For us, that's still not enough, and we'll get a little bit into that advocacy about that. So one of the reasons that we believe the bed quota was really implemented was the role of the private prison industry. Approximately 60% of detention beds are operated by private prison corporations. On the left is a really great infographic done by the Center for American Progress, and you can kind of see the year that the quota was enacted, there were 25 lobbyists representing Corrections Corporation of America. And on the right, there's a really great chart done by Grassroots Leadership about the privatization of ICE beds. And many of the beds that are held, that are in facilities run by private prison corporations are run by GEO Group and CCA. And they are the ones that are really sending in the majority of lobbyists. The increase in CCA's company value since the quota was enacted has about doubled. And even now, we continue to go into meetings with appropriators, and they'll tell us that lobbyists from CCA or GEO or other private prison corporations have already been in there to see them. So this is really no secret. It's an uphill battle. They're really outspending us in terms of lobbyists. They're people power going in, trying to make campaign contributions to a lot of the appropriators that are then going in and putting this language in the appropriations bill. So a little bit about the appropriations timeline. We operate, and I alluded to this earlier, we operate on fiscal years. So it starts on October 1st and it ends on September 20th. So right now, the government is operating on the fiscal year 2014 budget, which will end on September 30th of this year. And then on October 1st of this year, we'll start the fiscal year 2015 budget. So, you know, you've heard about the government shutdowns. That's pretty much because Congress cannot agree on bills. And so the way, I'll just quickly go over the timeline. Traditionally, the House of Representatives were supposed to, or actually, sorry, I'll get into this a little bit later. Let me just go through the timeline. So the way advocacy typically works is in August and September is when the president starts thinking about his budget request to Congress. And so the budget is really initiated with the administration, and they put together their budget recommendations based on what they believe they need. And so they being the administration and various agencies like DHS, and then the sub-agencies operating under DHS like ICE and CBP. So in August, NGOs, particularly those in DC, begin their budget recommendations process and try to meet with the administration, write some memos that explain our budget recommendations. And so For as many years as I can remember, we have asked for an elimination of the detention bed quota as part of our budget recommendations. So then in October and November, the Office of Management and Budget, which is responsible for pulling together the administration's budget request that then is passed on to Congress, they seek input from NGOs, and these are done in small groups. So there's an account manager for ICE. There's an account manager for CBP. There's an account manager for EOIR, which runs all of the immigration courts. And then those account managers will seek input from NGOs and advocates as they put together the budget. Then November through February, OMB also continues to get input from various agencies. So after, they've received some input from advocates, then they'll go, and it's known as a pass-back process. So OMB will kind of put stuff together, they'll pass it back to the agency for a review, and they kind of go back and forth until the administration finalizes the budget to submit to Congress. Technically, the president is required to submit his budget to Congress by the first Monday in February, but he has been pretty late recently. This year, he didn't submit it until March. So at that point, the administration, in ideally February, maybe early March, submits his budget proposal to Congress. So at this point, the House and the Senate both receive the same budget proposal, and then traditionally the House of Representatives would actually take the budget proposal and pass appropriations bills and then pass it along to the Senate. But more recently what has happened is the Senate appropriations subcommittees and the House subcommittees have started working on them almost simultaneously, although the Senate is a little bit behind in the process. So that's just kind of the timeline. And so there are appropriations committees, but then within the appropriations committee there's a subcommittee, and the appropriate subcommittee that's handling the quota is the Homeland Security subcommittee. So the Homeland Security subcommittee will hold hearings and mark up the DHS appropriations bill and then vote on it. So this has already happened. The Homeland Security subcommittee held hearings with Secretary Jay Johnson, DHS Secretary Jay Johnson, and the heads of ICE. And then they reviewed the bill and just a few weeks ago actually passed it out of the subcommittee, and the full appropriations committee was then to review it. And they can also make amendments in that for the DHS appropriations bill. The full committee hearing actually happened yesterday, and I'll get a little bit into that later. And then finally, after the full committee holds a hearing, votes, they report the bill to the House floor, which means it passes out of committee, and the entire House of Representatives will then vote on the bill. At that time, various members of Congress can choose to introduce amendments to the bill. So last year, in June of 2013, Representatives Deutsch and Foster introduced an amendment to eliminate the bed quota from the appropriations bill for DHS. The amendment didn't pass, but we are expecting that amendment to again be introduced by the end of this month. So a little bit on administrative and legislative advocacy. Advocates across the country have really spoken out against the quota, particularly in the last year and a half. A lot of that led to the Deutsch-Foster amendment that I just referred to, which didn't pass but received 190 votes, including 8 Republicans voting for it. They also, around the same time, a letter went to members of Congress signed by NGOs asking for an end to the quota. And there's been numerous letters sent to both Congress, appropriators, and the administration by NGOs and members of Congress asking for an end to the bed quota. So it's great that people are talking about it. In the fall, there was a letter to President Obama signed by 65 members of Congress asking him to eliminate the bed quota from his proposal. He didn't eliminate the bed quota from his proposal, and we saw for fiscal year 15, he included the around 30,500 number in his proposal. And then from last year until now, the last summer, the bed quota got significant media coverage, including on NPR, Bloomberg, Washington Post, New York Times, NBC, and the list goes on. And then advocates really started creating resources for communities and policymakers to end the quota. To the right is a screenshot of Civics video, Civics visitation network that's based in California. And they did a really fantastic video on the bed quota. There was a bed quota 101 call, and then of course, we launched our End the Quota campaign this March, shortly after the president submitted his budget proposal to Congress. From January till now, advocates have really started meeting with appropriators. As I kind of showed you the timeline, around the time the president submitted his budget proposal, many advocates were making calls to members of Congress asking for an elimination of the bed quota. So yesterday was the full Appropriations Committee markup of the DHS bill, and what we saw were Representatives Quigley, Honda, Lowy, Serrano, and Valadeo, who's a Republican, actually speaking out against the quota during the DHS markup. We also saw when the subcommittee was marking up the bill, and I mentioned that they have hearings with Secretary Johnson and ICE. During the subcommittee hearing with Secretary Johnson, Representatives Roybal Allard and Price spoke out against the quota and spent much of the hearing discussing flaws in our detention system. So the quota has been a really great way to get policymakers engaged in talking about detention issues. And we believe this month, with your help, we might be able to get the Deutsch-Foster Amendment passed. So again, as I said, Representatives Deutsch and Foster, when the DHS bill moves to the House floor for a vote by the entire House of Representatives, Representatives Deutsch, who is a Democrat from Florida, and Representative Foster, who's a Democrat from Illinois, plan to introduce this amendment, striking that quota language from the DHS bill. And so what we need is community support to get members of Congress voting for this amendment when it reaches the House floor. Because by the time it reaches the House floor, we're not going to have much time to do outreach at that point. So outreach really needs to have started now. One quick thing about the language in the bill. So it says DHS shall maintain a level of not less than 34,000 detention beds. So until now, we have believed that this 34,000 beds, it's not just maintain, but actually fill those beds with people. And we believe that's ICE's interpretation of the language and what has led to record-breaking numbers of folks in detention and deportation proceedings. However, more recently, as I mentioned, DHS Secretary Jay Johnson testified before Congress during the appropriations markup, and he said that he doesn't believe that the quota must be filled with people, but that it's just a requirement to be able to maintain 34,000 beds in case those beds are needed. The Office of Management and Budget, which I also mentioned pulls together the budget for the administration, has stated that the administration interprets the quota as a requirement not to fill beds, but just to maintain them. However, that doesn't really change anything. Requiring ICE to maintain beds still prevents ICE from terminating contracts in many ways. Even if the beds are empty or not filled, they're still required to operate these facilities in order to keep 34,000 beds in their budget, right, and operating. So today you might have seen that 150 men detained at the Pinal County Jail in Arizona signed and released a letter documenting the facility's conditions and calling on ICE to end its detention contract. 70 men at the jail began a hunger strike. At Pinal County Jail, ICE maintains a contract for 625 beds, which is part of this nationwide 34,000 detention bed quota. So that's an example of how we're seeing the quota's current impact. Whether it's a fill requirement or a maintain requirement, having a bottom line number in the appropriations language pushes ICE from keeping contracts with facilities, like Pinal County, or the photo of Eloy, which was also included in our expose and close reports, to maintain 34,000 beds. Also, some members of Congress still interpret it as a fill requirement. So even if the current president and his administration appear to believe it's a maintain requirement, that interpretation could switch with a future administration. And so we really just need to eliminate this language and make sure that there is no bottom line number of beds. And finally, I just want to add, we don't have any evidence that ICE is interpreting the quota any differently. This is part of the reason that DWN actually filed a FOIA with the Center for Constitutional Rights, because ICE has not explained how the quota impacts its decision-making process and whether they're continuing to detain vulnerable populations like pregnant women or elderly, or when they should be released, or how it's impacting their detention decisions generally. And so when we get more on that, we're hoping to get some documents next week. We'll definitely share. But until then, we still feel that ICE is interpreting this as a fill requirement regardless of the administration's public statements. So I know that that was a lot of information. I quickly just want to turn it over to Anu to talk a little bit about the Senate advocacy that's happening with respect to the bed quota, because I only focused on the House of Representatives, and then we'll open it up for some questions because I know that was a lot of information.
Hi, Madhu. Thanks so much for that. We can actually go on to the next slide. Okay. Okay, great. So Madhu did such a great job in the beginning when she started explaining the process of talking about how the budget, the appropriations process works, and how ultimately departments of the government find out how much they're allowed to spend and on what. She went very in-depth on what the House of Representatives process is, and the reality is that for kind of this specific instance, appropriations, deciding on the budgets for these departments, the Senate follows a very similar process. In fact, it actually mirrors the House process, and the two appropriations committees, the Senate Appropriations Committee and the House Appropriations Committee, end up working very closely together. You might remember that in order for any bill to make it to the President's desk, the House and the Senate have to pass identical versions of that bill before the President will decide whether to sign or veto it. Well, the same is true for appropriations, but Congress works a little bit different in that they try to get those agreements in place from the beginning. So back in December, the full appropriations committees in the Senate and the House, and typically what that means is that Senate Democrats and House Republicans, as the majorities in those two houses, worked together and agreed upon top-level fundings for each subcommittee to work within. So they decided what the overall number was going to be for each of the different departments, including Department of Homeland Security, which has its own subcommittee, the Homeland Security Subcommittee. And the President, in his budget, abided by those top-level numbers. Now, the committee itself and the subcommittee has a lot of flexibility to determine how that money gets divided up. And the perfect example of that is how much of that money is dedicated towards detention beds and the detention bed quota. So on your screen right now, what you're seeing are the people that, the senators that really have the opportunity to decide what ultimately gets voted out of the Senate in the DHS budget. So the top picture are the DHS subcommittee chair and ranking members. So that's Senator Mary Landrieu from Louisiana on the left. She's a Democrat. And on the right is Dan Coates, who's a Republican from Indiana. So those two senators working together with their staff, and they're in the Senate, there's a lot more collaboration between the Democrats and the Republicans than there tends to be in the House. So those two senators working fairly closely together along with their staff will soon release their proposed DHS budget. Now, this will most likely be different than what the President submitted back in March, but it will most likely be less different than what the House eventually pass, simply because the Democrats control the Senate and are more likely to agree with the president on a wider range of issues in terms of policy. They still have to compromise with Republicans to a large regard because they will eventually, if the DHS budget ever makes it to the floor, need 60 votes, which means that they will have to have a handful of Republicans who will vote with them. But it does mean that it's a little bit more sympathetic of a process if we like what the president included in his original budget. Across the bottom, the 5 pictures on the right, so everyone but the woman farthest to the left, are the 5 Democratic members of the DHS subcommittee. So those include Senator Tester on the far right from Montana, Senator Leahy next to him from Vermont, who many of you might recognize as the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Murray from Washington State, Senator Coons from Delaware, and then Senator Begich from Alaska. And then next to Senator Begich is Senator Murkowski, also from Alaska, who's an independent or was a write-in Republican candidate for the Alaska Senate race, and tends to be a little bit more sympathetic on immigration-related issues. She, in fact, voted both for the DREAM Act in 2010 and also for Senate Bill S744. So these are primary targets for DHS appropriations on the Senate side. Our goal, much in the same way as the House, although a little bit earlier, is to have a good vote come out of the Senate subcommittee for DHS appropriations. So we don't know yet, it hasn't been released, what Mary Landrieu, the chair of the committee, is going to include, whether or not she is going to include the bed quota language, and whether or not she's going to include the president's lower number of detention beds, or if she's going to go and include the House's number, which is 34,000 versus 30,500. But once we know those two things, what the budget is, once they release the budget, we will be doing a lot of work to target these 8 people to try to get a good vote out of committee. Okay, can we go to the next slide, Molly? Okay, I'm almost done, I promise. So once the bill comes out of the subcommittee, it will go to the Appropriations Committee of the Whole, so the whole thing. And that committee is chaired by the Senator from Maryland, Barbara Mikulski, who you see pictured here. Now, there's a couple of things that can happen. If the subcommittee report out of the bill, if what they vote out of the subcommittee is good, meaning that it does not include the bed quota language and or includes the lower bed number, then we will want to do everything we can to shore up Senator Mikulski and the other Democrats on the committee to not allow any amendments. If it's bad, if the DHS subcommittee on appropriations includes the bed quota language and includes the higher number of detention beds, then we're going to want to try to introduce an amendment, or at least have some debate about whether or not that's what the right thing to do. Eventually we'll go to the floor. Once it gets to the floor on the Senate, it will be almost impossible to make those kinds of amendments. Now, we're anticipating that we'll have at least a better bill come out of the Senate than comes out of the House. And like I said, it's the combination of those two things, eliminating the bed quota language plus the number of detention beds that are allocated. What happens next is that Senator Mikulski and other Senate Democratic leadership will meet with the chair of the House Appropriations Committee and other House Republican leadership to try to iron out the differences between the two DHS funding bills. And that is when we really need Senator Mikulski as a leader on that committee for the Democrats to stand up and fight for this provision so that it doesn't get negotiated away as one more thing that can be traded for something else that the Democrats want. And that's why I really singled her out in this slide when we talk about advocacy. We really need to do a lot of work to make sure that Senator Mikulski thinks this is an important issue, understands how important this issue is, and is willing to go to the mat for it. And that can be everything from in-district lobby visits to emails, phone calls, letters, media advocacy, and then especially bringing the issue home for her and elevating the personal stories from people who are detained in Maryland facilities. So if any of you have any ability to do organizing work in Maryland, whether you are located in Maryland or if you know people based in Maryland, my contact information will be in these slides. Please reach out to me, and we'd love to work with you to try to make sure that Senator Mikulski fights to end the detention bed quota. And that's it for me.
Great. We're going to go ahead.
And Matthew.
I think we have one question from Cindy Martinez. So I'm going to unmute you, Cindy.
Oh no, one of the I had a question at the very beginning, but just you can come back to me. I'm not ready for that. Sorry.
Okay. We don't have any other folks who've raised their hands. Does anybody else, if you want to ask a question, you can click the hand button that you see there.
No other questions?
We have a question from Renata Marus. Renata, are you there? Renata? I don't think we can hear you, Renata, if you're speaking. We unmuted you. Okay, maybe we'll try to come back to you. Are there any other questions that folks have? Okay, I don't think I see any other questions, so I think let's go ahead and move forward with the rest of the presentation.
All right, I'll turn it over to Catalina to discuss our End the Quota campaign.
Great, thank you. And yeah, just a reminder, you can also type comments and questions on the chat box to the right. So obviously, you know, part of it is understanding the legislative process and what's happening throughout that, but also, you know, I think we realized very quickly through our membership as WN, but many of the communities we're working with and our allies, that we obviously need political power to be able to end this quota and also really, you know, understand and connect with how this quota affects our communities and people directly, you know, because this ultimately is about people's lives and livelihoods, and this is why we decided to launch a campaign to end this quota. So we did the official launch of the End The Quota campaign shortly after the president submitted his budget request in March of 2014, and this was after meetings, just kind of thinking through the impact on our communities, really trying to understand the process, but also obviously DWN members and some of the other organizations that we work with as allies also, you know, telling us that this was an important issue to focus on, and, you know, really understanding that eliminating the quota can definitely be an important step in reducing, you know, and ultimately ending detention. So, you know, as I was saying, obviously we wanted to really understand the impact of this quota and started to really think about some of the messaging around these, as well as understanding the human impact of it. So, you know, this is some of the main things that kept coming up for us in terms of, you know, with a guaranteed need of detention beds or these jail cells. The detention bed quota essentially forces the use of facilities that have poor track records and where many human rights abuses and dozens of deaths have occurred. It's 144 deaths in detention since 2003. And then the cost to maintain this system is excessive. Obviously, you know, in 2012, as mentioned before, ICE detained close to 500,000 immigrants, and the current detention budget is just short of $2 billion. And then obviously, you know, having a quota on how many people have to be locked up every day puts a price tag on immigrant lives. You know, the policy leads to Congress and ICE treating immigrants as we were numbers, just to fill a quota and products to be bought and sold, not even as real people with children and loved ones that are depending on us. And then the quota not only impacts hundreds and thousands of immigrants that go through the detention system each year, but the families and partners and communities that have been torn apart because of immigration, detention, and deportation. And, you know, obviously this quota also incentivizes targeting people for deportation in order to fill these jail cells. So after our launch of the End The Quota campaign, these are just some examples of activities that have happened since March and even earlier on, but I think very quickly, obviously, we've done some calling dates, so many organizations got involved in these, sending it out to our lists, and really trying to generate a lot of people calling their member of Congress, and also doing meetings with their member of Congress. And this is a sample script, you know, my name is, I'm calling from certain city and state, and an urged Congress member to oppose the wasteful and inhumane immigration detention bed quota in any appropriations bill. And here we have the number of the congressional switchboard as well. So we included, you know, these in many of our calling days, action alerts, and obviously, you know, the next few weeks will be very important for doing this as well, and the main ask will also be for people urging Congress members to vote for the Deutsch and Foster amendment that will strike the quota. Other things that have happened, for example, Georgia Detention Watch and Georgia Dreamers Alliance did an education event. It was a resistance to deportation and detention panel and conversation. This took place in April 24th. They had several people speaking about, you know, history, current context of detention and deportation, and they also linked the work that's happening with the End The Quota campaign, the Not One More campaign, and the Bring Them Home campaign. So this was a great, you know, example of also, you know, collaborating and seeing, connecting the dots within the larger system of detention and deportation, but obviously also the movement against this. Then most recently, as part of our Detention Watch Network conference, we also had an amazing action in DC. May 9th, we had about 150 to 100 people. We started at the Smithsonian Museum area, and we marched. We did a stop at the American History Museum and really, you know, shared with many people that were around there, you know, some of the facts, some of the quota messaging as well. And then we marched through the streets, went to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection headquarters, and also do a bit of a speak out outside there. And then marched onto the White House, where 5 courageous people risked arrest as part of the action, while, you know, many of us were also there really cheering and supporting them, but obviously, you know, calling attention to to the impact of the quota, we had flyers. We were passing these flyers to many people that were there as tourists and passersby as well, and obviously generated a lot of media attention. So this is another example of different things that have happened since the launch of the campaign. And then Madhu had mentioned already about the video that Civic made, and then we also, DWN also did a video with images of the action and, you know, parts of where people were speaking about their direct experience with detention and deportation and how it connects to the quota. So those videos are available online on our website, endthequota.org. And then obviously, you know, just today, as Madhu mentioned as well, I think what's been really great is also being able to connect it to the day-to-day work, you know, when we're doing work against these horrible conditions in detention centers, you know, connecting it to the quota as well. You know, the reason why some of these facilities continue to be open is because of there's a quota. And we can see, you know, like some of the messaging that they use today in the petition to end the contract with Pinal County Jail. Yeah, connecting, you know, the 625 detention beds to the 34,000 detention beds, and how this quota guarantees the need for detention and essentially forces the use of facilities that have poor track records like PCJ. And then, you know, I think also there's been the generation of many, many resources now for education, for advocacy. This is just a list that we actually have on our website. So there's a narrative, there's an infographic, there's a timeline, there's the videos, there's like sample op-eds that have already been placed, there's interviews, so many, many resources that you all, you know, can definitely use for your work in your own communities in terms of education or the advocacy work or organizing as well. So most recently, as you all know, and we're in the middle of our 30 days to end the 34,000 immigrant detention quota, which is from June 9th to July 12th. As Madhu explained earlier, this is crucial time right now to really put pressure and show our political power to Congress and the administration in our push to end this quota. So because the next month is such a crucial time, many of our members during our conference really, you know, came with this idea of having 34 days to end the quota. So we hope that all of you can get involved, you know, any activity as little or as big as it is, it's going to have an impact and it's important. So these are 6 things that you can do to get involved in the 34 days to end the quota. One very simple one is to share the new DWN's End The Quota infographic, which is on our website and also on Facebook and Twitter. And it's kind of making the connections of enforcement with the quota, as well as, you know, the horrible conditions that we see in these detention centers, and then obviously talking about the impact and the connection with private prison profits. You can also hold educational events as the one that we mentioned before from Georgia Detention Watch, or community forums, teachings about immigration detention system and the impact of the quota on our communities. And obviously make calls and visit members of Congress to ask them to eliminate the quota from the fiscal year 2015 appropriations bill. And you can contact Madhu for support on that as well. These are pictures of, you know, a legislative visit we had with people that are directly impacted by detention. And then the other one is a timeline educational event that we had earlier in the year. For organize an action or vigil outside a detention center, ICE office, or congressional member's office. There's a few of these vigils or actions slowly lining up, so obviously we would really like to be able to have some presence also on the streets. So if anyone is interested in putting together an action or a vigil, please contact me. My contact info is here, and I'm happy to support in any way. And then obviously doing some media, whether it's writing an op-ed or letter to the editor, and sharing, our action alerts, videos, infographics, posters, fact sheets through social media, through your networks, or going out, flyering. All work is needed. All hands on deck right now is definitely needed. So that's it for my part. Definitely want to open it once again for any questions.
If folks want to raise their hand if they have questions, we did have a few written questions. So one from Tori Brown was, are there any targets besides Mikulski?
Hi, yeah, this is Anu. There are all of the senators that sit on the Senate Appropriations Committees, and specifically the Homeland Security Appropriations Committee subcommittee are targets now, while they're still going to be debating the bill. And those were those 6 that I showed the pictures of earlier. And then eventually the targets will expand more in the Senate, but Senator Mikulski does have the lion's share of decision-making at this point right now.
And quickly in the House, we are kind of beyond just the appropriators making the decisions and really focusing more on the Deutsche Foster vote and trying to get votes in the entire House of Representatives. And our focus really there are getting more Republicans to vote for the amendment. So if any of you folks do have relationships with Republican offices in your districts, this is the time to start asking and educating them on the quota and asking for them to vote when the Deutsche Foster Amendment comes up for a vote.
Great. And I wanted to mention a few comments, and then we had a question. So from Eduardo Samaniego, he said that Georgia Detention Watch had that panel that Catalina mentioned with over 70 people, and they called John Barrow asking him to not support the quota. They talked about the negative impacts, but they said the panel was really helpful in getting folks to know about the quota, so it's probably something that other folks want to maybe consider doing. And then somebody else mentioned, Sophia Korchmar mentioned just a question of if we're connecting with any groups working on prison issues and CCA and GEO and the sort of connections between sentencing practices and policing. And so, I know we're working with Enlace, who's working against those groups. But if you have other ideas, let us know. And then Kathy is asking, are there any key target dates over the next month, and what will happen on July 9th? Kathy, take that one.
I'm not sure about July 9th. I think, at least as far as the House appropriations goes, we are expecting the week of June 23rd for the bill to be brought to the entire House floor, and that week for the Deutsche Foster Amendment to be introduced. It's possible it could get pushed back to the week after July 4th, but most likely we're expecting to see a full vote before the end of the month. So in terms of House targeting, that's kind of why Catalina had said all hands on deck now, and Silky, mentioned how Georgia Detention Watch had pushed Barrow, and I think those are really great examples of pushing not only Republicans but Democrats, because there were 11 Democrats that voted against the Deutsche Foster Amendment, actively voted to keep that quota in there, and those included Democrats from Arizona, Virginia, Georgia, California, Illinois, New York, where I know we have some active members. And so right now is really kind of a key targeting time. Anu, I don't know if you have stuff to add on the Senate side.
Just that the timing is still a little bit up in the air. We're thinking that we'll probably see the chairwoman Landrieu's proposal within the next few weeks, and that the subcommittee will most likely debate it either the last week of June or the second or third week of July.
Okay, and a couple quick comments. One, Matt Gossage is asking if the Georgia folks could send any of the materials that they use that can be helped with for community education events, and I think Catalina can follow up on that. And then Sister Dominica Lobianco is saying that the Philly area is planning a rally at the York County Detention Center on June 28th, which is really exciting. That's great to hear. And then I think we have a question from Isabel Vinet Chave. I'm going to unmute you, Chave, if you're there. You should be unmuted. I think you might need to unmute yourself, Chave, if you're there. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on. Okay. Chave, we can't hear you if you're talking. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on there. Are there other questions that folks have? So Cindy Martinez is asking, who were the Democrats who voted to keep the bed quota in the bill in New York?
I can quickly.
Yeah, we can send, or do you want to look it up, Mother? Or?
It's just one. It's just one. Bill Owens. He's from New York, and he is actually on the Appropriations Homeland Security Subcommittee, so that's even worse. He is one of the offices we've heard private prison lobbyists have visited, so I think it's really important for his office to hear from constituents that they're watching his vote, because he hasn't really expressed much interest in eliminating the bed quota.
And for any of those that are thinking of doing actions, events, anything, please definitely communicate with us about those. We can help kind of amplify and really spread the word about your events, and, you know, obviously put national attention to events you know, in cities and communities. So please definitely contact us, let us know what you're doing, and we are more than happy to support in any way that we can, but definitely, you know, help spread the word through our lists as well.
Okay, are there any other questions? Unfortunately, I don't know if Renata or Chave, if you're there. I think, Renata, you have a question that you just said, when should we be pushing our own congressman? Until I've had a conversation with my congressman about this, and he had no idea about the amendment. So what's the timeline for pushing your congressperson?
So I think that's the tricky part. The amendment isn't really introduced until the bill goes to the House floor. So right now, I think it's really important for you to start doing the education and let them know that that amendment will be introduced. It obviously hasn't yet because the bill has yet to reach the House floor. So I think right now is the time to start educating your congressman, which it sounds like you're doing a great job of doing of that right now. So share the materials with them. Let them know that they can expect to see this amendment, and you'll be watching to see if they vote for it. And then definitely please follow up with me so that I can also reach out. And Deutsch and Foster themselves will also be doing, the members themselves, when the amendment is voted on, they actually go around and try to get more votes. And so it's helpful to know, for those of you that are doing these in-district visits or pushing your local congressperson, for us at DWN to be able to share that information with Deutsch and Foster's offices as they go out and get more votes for this amendment.
And if you are on the DWN email list, we will send an action alert as soon as we find out when the amendment is going to be introduced, which, yeah, right now it looks like it's the week of June 23rd, but there's not a set timeline, but definitely if you want to join our mailing list, we'll be communicating with people and constantly sending updates about the timeline on this.
So I think Chave might be on now if you want to ask your question.
Oh, thank you, Silky. I don't know what happened. It froze me out and kicked me out. But anyway, I have two questions. One is maybe you already talked about it, but I came in late to the webinar, and thank you for the space. Is about the situation of unaccompanied minors and how this is raising a lot of media and public awareness about the abuses in the detention centers that are being suffered by children, and how they should be actually treated as refugees. So I'm wondering what other members are doing about this to connect the End The Quota narrative. This is, I think, a great opportunity because people are really alarmed, people that didn't know about immigrant detention, and I was wondering if there's anything going on in other members that are doing. That's the first question. The second one is Representative Ted Deutsch is in my county. We've been following for the last 2-3 years his efforts to do advocacy to end the quota. But we were wondering if you have an updated list of Floridians that have signed to that amendment or are still missing, because I believe, for instance, Debbie Wasserman Schultz has not supported it and would like to have an updated list if you have one. Thank you.
So quickly, on the last point, we don't have any strong targets from Florida. For example, I haven't seen Wasserman Schultz on any target list that I have had. She's not on the list from last year of Democrats who didn't vote, who voted against the amendment. But I do think for any Republicans from Florida, and this might be tough, but I think, if you have those relationships, to try to reach out to those folks and just at least educate them. And I think the more education you do, even with Democrats, about the bed quota, they're all talking to each other, and I think that's really important. To just make sure that folks are aware of this amendment coming up and about the bed quota, because there's so many members of Congress and only a handful are really in tune with what's happening in detention.
And then on the first question, Anu, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, if you knew of particular members addressing this issue of unaccompanied minors.
I don't. It actually is a lot of the same members on the appropriations committees because of this funding issue, but I don't know more than that.
Yeah, I think with the unaccompanied minors, Representative Roybal Allard, who's on the Appropriations Committee, also I believe she introduced an amendment during the markup yesterday to address the issue of unaccompanied minors and the conditions they're being held in. So there are members of Congress that are working on it, and like I said, there is some overlap. There are also some really great DWN members that are doing some advocacy on that front. And if you're on the DWN listserv, you should be getting some of those emails and can connect with those groups.
Yeah, and I think, just like to connect it even largely, even if there's not direct targets in your district or your state, I think just talking and exposing, the realities of what's happening with the detention system, exposing, the conditions of detention centers in your area, getting media, to cover these issues, and using this moment to also really, expose, and in some ways put out all this information, and the total inhumanity of this system is going to be really important, and it's also going to help shift, the narrative, and help shift more of the thinking around this, and that will also ultimately impact policy as well. So I think it's good to look at it on both sides, legislatively, but also, changing this public narrative as well.
So I think that's it for questions if we want to close out.
Yeah, so thank you very much everyone for joining. You can see on endthequota.org we have many of the resources there that we shared with you during this webinar, and we will send an email to everyone who joined and our list as well with this PowerPoint as well with the recording. And it sounds like definitely people also want some information on targets, so we can also help put together something for that as well. So thank you so much, and hopefully we'll hear from you soon about getting involved in the 34 days of action to end the quota. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.